Jack was a weird child. He grew up in a weird part of London, a part of London that wasn't really London, but wasn't really anything else either. He liked reading, getting bullied by bigger kids, failing exams and not liking marzipan. He later got into motorcycles and had an interest in women. That interest was not shared by them, fairly obviously.
Of course.
At an early age, he discovered that he didn't have superpowers.
I did a terrible, stupid thing.
Later on, he discovered that social isolation also wasn't a superpower and began to become even weirder. You may have noticed, his parents gave up and had pretty much decided to sell him for medical experimentation when, in the summer of 1977, everything changed. The first Star Wars movie hit the big screen in 1977, a sleeper film that nobody expected to do particularly well. But it did do well, it did well enough to make cinematic history, and it changed the way people look at movies forever. It became a fascination and an obsession for children everywhere. George Lucas, the man behind the film, became a household name and an icon to sad, lonely and funny-smelling people everywhere. Of course, we now know what sort of person he really is.
Just the worst!
What was special about Star Wars was that, because nobody believed in it, Lucas was able to retain the merchandise rights for himself. So every toy, lunchbox, poster and collectible, personally earned him money. And this movie made a huge amount of money. That meant that there was a huge bandwagon for everyone to jump on, and jump on it, everyone did.
Hello! I like money!
Old science fiction TV shows and movies were hastily repeated on television, new cinematic projects began and most of them were smashed together quickly, hoping to cash in on the wave of success rolling off of Star Wars. Most of these films were pretty awful. Science fiction has been called the genre of ideas, and is effectively the genre which takes our imagination into the realms of wondering what might happen. Mostly, stories of this kind are set somewhere in the future, but they don't strictly have to be. They're stories that loosely use our understanding of the world and use it to pose questions. They take us out of our own lives and into places where anything can happen, and, for that reason, they make a strong impact on the minds of impressionable young people. The novel, Frankenstein, is often touted as being the first true science fiction novel, although this is never overtly stated by anyone who's read it, since it's a hopeless pile of crap. But sci-fi is a powerful literary genre as well as a popular subject for films and TV. In fact, anything that poses question by advancing ideas into what could be possible is effectively a science fiction. This includes superhero films, horror, and has elements that cross over into multiple other areas.
We can do anything!
Jack's obsession branched out into television. Old episodes of the 1960s TV show, Star Trek, were repeated late at night, hoping to catch some interest from new fans of the genre. And it worked. Trek is very different from Star Wars, and young Jack began to notice. In broad terms, there are two main kinds of science fiction, and people can be quite rigid in their interpretation. Luckily, since people who take this too seriously aren't going to pass on their cripplingly unfortunate genes, their stupidity will likely die out with them.
Sounds good to me.
There are two main camps in terms of this genre. There is science fiction and there is sci-fi. Let me explain the difference.
Nobody cares.
Sci-fi is soft science fiction. That means that it is essentially science fantasy. The technology is not explained because it's not necessary to explain it. Star Wars is a soft sci-fi because there is no need for us to know how things work. They travel faster than the speed of light. How? They press the big red button. The fact that the characters know is enough for us. We don't need, nor would we benefit from questioning any deeper. Stories like this tend to be less about the technology and focus more on other elements, such as story, characters, or politics. Sci-fi comedies tend to follow this route, since they don't need to dwell on the heavier story elements. There is a tendency for some fans to look down their nose on stories of this type, while gently stroking their bearded necks with their orange, Cheeto dust-covered fingers, but that's very short-sighted. Some of the best books and films of the genre are of this very type. For instance, Blade Runner, a classic movie, is a soft sci-fi. None of the technology is explained or gone into, it is driven entirely by the story and the characters, and it works perfectly because of it. These are simply tales where the technology is not the focus.
People are what matters.
Hard science fiction does the opposite. It takes the hard scientific principles and puts them right at the heart of the story. Often, these are less character or less driven by the narrative. They focus on exploring hard science, they're asking questions about what might happen if our more recent discoveries follow to their logical conclusion. Movies of this type are Jurassic Park, which, while not an actually particularly serious film, is based entirely on a single scientific idea of cloning extinct animals. Another example would be the written works of Arthur C. Clarke, whose written work is the literary equivalent of slipping into a coma. Star Trek resonated with young Jack because it edged more towards the soft end of science fiction. But it resonated for a much more important reason. Star Wars was set a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, but Star Trek was closer to home. It was about people from Earth exploring the galaxy. Now it wasn't an action-adventure story set in some distant corner of an expansive universe, now it was happening right here. This was something we all might one day be part of.
We'll all be dead.
The most well-known television rip-off of Star Wars was Battlestar Galactica. This tried very hard to bring weekly episodic chunks of Star Wars to an audience hungry for more. It looked just enough like a sprawling space opera to catch our interest and just different enough not to get sued into oblivion. The premise of this story was that the evil Cylon robots had wiped out all the humans in a faraway part of space. A single fleet of ships with a scattered collection of survivors escaped and limped through the galaxy looking for the legendary lost tribe of mankind who had settled on a faraway planet known as Earth. This was another example of soft sci-fi that focused mostly on the characters as they struggled to survive. While a very popular show, it lacked in the writing department, and Jack was beginning to notice. He wanted more depth, he wanted to have more answers to more of the interesting questions. He was beginning to outgrow shows of this type.
It's about time!
Another cult television show from the era struck a chord. Ulysses 31 was an animated television show made by a Canadian and French studio. It had a Japanese anime style to it but was quite different. The vehicles had a distinct and unique look to it, and the characters were cleverly scripted. But what was special about this show was that it broadly told the story of Homer's Odyssey, using ancient literature as a starting point. It took the original tales and twisted them into a science fiction setting. Jack was beginning to see the potential in this genre.
Oh, that's good, I guess.
By now, films were beginning to hit the big screen. Disney tried their luck with the bizarre mess of a film, The Black Hole. It took an impressive cast to the far future where a vast spaceship crewed by zombies hovered at the edge of a sinister tear in space and time. They took science and threw it entirely out of the window, while also setting the entire film around a scientific question. This cluttered story had a bizarre ending where they maybe went to hell, or perhaps didn't. Who can tell? Another popular slice of nonsense was Battle Beyond the Stars.
Does your species have kissing?
Oh, yes. We have that.
Just like Star Wars, it followed the adventure of a naive young farm boy who stands up against a space bully. It was one of the most blatant rip-offs of Star Wars imaginable, even the villain's ship was a cross between the two different vessels at the beginning of the original film. The hero ship, Nell, was far more interesting. The film was made by a director who had previously specialized in films for the discerning gentleman, if you know what I mean. Nell was designed to look like a naked female, which escaped the notice of the children the film was aimed at, but is very noticeable to more adult eyes. But, interestingly, both of these films were based on deeper ideas. Battle Beyond the Stars was a futuristic retelling of The Magnificent Seven, a Western film. That was, in turn, a remake of Seven Samurai. Black Hole borrowed from religious mythology to frame its ideas. Jack was beginning to take notice of things like this.
I don't care.
The explosion of interest in this kind of story had the knock-on effect of popularizing near-future what-if science fiction. During the 80s, a new science fiction subgenre emerged, and the rise of super vehicles began. These were usually television shows about a person, or small team, operating a machine that was highly advanced and special. The most popular was Knight Rider, about a wandering hero in an indestructible computerized car that talked back, jumped over things and could see through walls. Airwolf did the same thing with a helicopter, Street Hawk did it with a motorcycle, and there were multiple others. Blue Thunder did a similar thing as Airwolf but with a cinematic movie, as did Firefox, about a stolen Russian superjet. These things varied in style and tone but all followed a very similar format. Shows of this kind brought the concept of science fiction even closer to our own front door. Now these weren't stories of spaceships in the future, now they were things we might be seeing in our own lifetime. Films came out that also brought science fiction all the way home. Terminator told the story of a killer robot sent back from the future to kill a woman who would later give birth to a man who would change the world. This cleverly tied futuristic concepts right to our own home. The film, while on the surface a violent action film, had surprising depths. The machines represented the state. They stood in for powerful governments trying to control us, with the future killer machines having flashing blue and red lights, to tell us that they were a metaphor for the police. The killer robot himself looked like us, but beneath the surface, he was something completely different. Movies like this had a distinct undercurrent of political value to them. They were using the genre to make a political point about our world, the way it was now.
It's about sending a message.
But there came a point where movies just didn't deliver the depth that Jack was looking for. It was time to start reading books. The first novel that he fell in love with was Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. The author, Douglas Adams, was a genius who crafted a smart, witty sci-fi that told the story of an everyman character, Arthur Dent, on a journey through the universe, a universe where nothing was what he thought it was. The supporting characters told a story in their own right. Marvin, the robot, was fed up and depressed, as he represented the downtrodden workers of the world. He is ignored, despite being smarter than they are, and is treated with contempt. Anyone who has worked for a living knows this feeling very well. Zaphod is a narcissistic megalomaniac with two heads. His two faces and massive ego means that he represents politicians and leaders, the untrustworthy maniacs running our world. And Ford, he stands in for the writers and artists, tagging along with anyone who will have him, failing to make an impact and doing nothing more useful than drinking himself half to death while clinging to a towel. This story warns us of the dangers of the banks stealing our lives while warning us that nothing is what we think it is. And, Douglas Adams should know, he went to school with the politicians and bankers and found out how things worked firsthand. Jack then found Isaac Asimov. He was a scientist and author. His work on the fictional future of robotics was groundbreaking. He applied the laws of robotics to them as a metaphor for our own ingrained instincts and used the concept to explore the human condition. Jack had found what he was looking for.
How much longer?
Along the way, there were many other inspirations. Batman, made in 1989, took a new look at superhero movies. It brought fringe characters to the cinematic mainstream. It changed the way we looked at films of this type by adding a dark tone, wrapping the protagonist in armor and exploring the psychology of the characters. No more was Bruce Wayne just a man in a silly costume. Now he was a splintered psyche, split into two distinct personalities by the traumatic events of his childhood. Alan Moore, an exceptionally awful human being, was, however, an exceptionally gifted writer. His comic book work showed how smart any kind of writing could actually be. His story, V for Vendetta, posed many social questions that remain relevant today. Another comic book character worthy of note is Judge Dredd. This is a satirical character shown as a vile fascist controller in a future where most of the world has been destroyed, much like in Alan Moore's work. It uses comedy to shine a light on the dark machinations that go on behind the scenes in our own world. Blade Runner, as mentioned before, was a cyberpunk classic. It pitched a man against machines, but machines so perfect that nobody could tell them apart anymore. Stories like this are designed to make us wonder what it actually means to be human. The Matrix took the allegory of the cave and turned it into a science fiction story that suggested that humanity was enslaved by our own creations. 1984 is the best-selling science fiction novel of all time. It's set in a dystopian future where control of the population is absolute and you can be arrested for thought crimes against a government that is always listening to everything you say. In fact, exactly that is now happening in many parts of the world. So this is why science fiction is so popular, and so important. It uses the future, our own technology, as a mirror for humanity. It holds up the idea of what if, and lets us use it to explore our own thoughts. It's a genre for the intelligent, a way for us to engage the darkest and best parts of ourselves in the exploration of who we really are. All stories are really all about one thing. They are all an exploration of ourselves. They ask what it means to be human. Who am I? What is this world and how do we fit into it? Sci-fi is uniquely placed to do this. It lets us push the boundaries imposed upon us and go further than we thought we could.
Maybe too far.
If we look beyond the stories, we see the inspirations. Science is inspired by wondering about exactly the questions posed by these books and films. So Jack became so obsessed by this genre that he began writing his own. And many people like him found that using these stories was a way to explore the world around us. So next time you meet a fan of science fiction, maybe you should ignore their crippling social anxiety, the horrendous smell, their appalling personal hygiene, their awkwardness, their disgusting sense of style, and their lonely, tragic lack of human connections. Maybe deep down, they're just like you. Or, maybe not. I don't care.